Callum Reyes came to fix a broken server. That was all he expected that cold morning in Chicago, when the wind came off the lake in that sharp, relentless way it always did in late winter, rattling the glass towers along Wacker Drive. He had no idea that within 1 hour, his entire life would tilt sideways. That a single locked file would pull him into the orbit of a woman the whole industry thought it understood, but did not understand at all. He carried his tool bag over one shoulder, walked into the lobby of Meridian Cognition Group, and thought only about the invoice he would send once the job was done. He could not have guessed that the woman running that billion-dollar company was about to ask him a question that would change both of their lives, forever. For nearly 7 years, Callum had lived a quiet, almost invisible existence. He took freelance contracts fixing corporate infrastructure, patching firewalls, untangling the kind of technical disasters that made junior engineers panic. He did the work well, charged fair prices, and never advertised the fact that he used to build encryption systems for one of the largest intelligence contractors on the East Coast. He had walked away from that career after his brother's death in a car accident he still blamed himself for missing the phone call about, and after the slow unraveling of a friendship that had once felt unbreakable. Callum did not talk about that chapter. He simply worked with his hands, fixed what was broken, and went home to an apartment that held more silence than furniture. He liked it that way, or told himself he did. There was a peace in being underestimated. Clients saw a man in his late 30s with tired eyes and a canvas jacket, and they assumed he was just another contractor pulled from a staffing agency. They never asked about the 14 years he had spent behind classified clearance walls, solving problems that most people would never be allowed to hear about. Callum preferred it that way. Recognition had cost him too much once before, and he had learned to live smaller, quieter, and safer. That morning, an emergency request had come through his usual channel, marked urgent, paying double his normal rate. The company was Meridian Cognition Group, one of the fastest rising names in machine learning and predictive security software in the entire Midwest. Callum had heard of it, of course. Everyone in the tech corridor had heard of it. What he had not expected was the tension radiating from every employee he passed once he stepped off the elevator on the executive floor. A junior assistant met him near the reception desk, her hands trembling slightly as she handed him a visitor badge. She lowered her voice as if the walls themselves might report her. She warned him that the server belonged to the chief executive's personal division, a woman named Adrienne Voss, and that she was, in the assistant's careful words, extremely exacting. Nobody who failed her expectations ever returned for a second contract. 2 different security firms had already tried and failed over the past week, and each of them had left the building looking rattled, as though they had walked out of an audit rather than an office. Callum only nodded. He had spent years working under case officers who did not tolerate excuses, and a demanding executive did not frighten him in the slightest. What interested him more was the technical detail buried in the ticket. The server was not merely slow or offline. It was actively rejecting every authentication attempt, cycling through a self-defense protocol as if something inside it believed it was under attack. That kind of problem intrigued him far more than any warning about a difficult employer ever could. He thanked the assistant, adjusted the strap of his tool bag, and walked toward the private data closet at the end of the hallway, unaware that behind that door sat evidence of a woman who had spent years building walls no one had ever managed to breach. The room was small and windowless, nothing like the polished glass office he'd expected from a woman worth hundreds of millions of dollars. A single rack server blinked red in the corner, its access panel already pried open by 2 previous attempts. Callum set his bag down and studied the error log for a moment before touching a single key. The system had locked into a defensive loop, wiping partial memory every few minutes, treating every login as a hostile intrusion. He had seen this kind of behavior only a handful of times in his career, and each time it had meant something far more interesting than a simple malfunction. He pulled a small diagnostic drive from his bag, inserted it, and began the slow, patient work of listening to what the machine was trying to tell him, unaware that in a few short minutes, he would be staring at a file that was never meant for his eyes. The information security team at Meridian had spent a full week on that same server, and each of them had walked away defeated. They were talented engineers by any ordinary measure, sharp, well-trained, accustomed to solving problems quickly under pressure. But this particular malfunction had resisted every conventional fix they attempted. They had rebuilt the authentication layer twice, replaced the network card, run diagnostic sweeps that should have caught any obvious corruption. Nothing worked. The system simply refused to trust anyone, locking down at random intervals, wiping logs, occasionally flashing warnings that made no logical sense given the architecture involved. Callum crouched beside the rack and watched the pattern of failure scroll past for several minutes before he touched anything. He had learned long ago that most people rush to fix a problem before they understood it, and that rushing almost always made things worse. He preferred to watch first, to let the machine reveal its own logic before he tried to impose a solution. Within a few minutes, he noticed something the other engineers had missed entirely: a corrupted certificate, buried 3 layers deep, that had been deliberately backdated to look older than the system itself. It was not a virus. It was not the work of some outside hacker probing for a weakness. It was something far more mundane and, to Callum, far more interesting. Someone inside the company had built a private vault on this server years ago, then buried the access certificate so thoroughly that the machine itself no longer recognized its rightful owner. It was the kind of problem that could only happen when a person needed to hide something even from their own IT department. He opened a command window, rebuilt the trust chain by hand, and rewrote a single certificate that nobody else had thought to examine. The fix took him barely 25 minutes from start to finish, a fraction of the time the previous teams had spent failing to understand the problem in the first place. When the server finally stabilized, the assistant who had let him in stood frozen in the doorway, staring at the terminal as if she had just witnessed something impossible. Word of the repair began spreading through the floor within minutes. Employees whispering to each other that the strange contractor with the canvas jacket had solved in 25 minutes what 2 entire security firms could not solve in a week. As the vault finally decrypted, a single file opened automatically on the screen, the last thing the system had been protecting so fiercely. Callum expected a spreadsheet, or source code, or some proprietary algorithm worth guarding. Instead, an audio file began to play on its own, a voicemail, saved and resaved so many times over the years that its file properties traced back further than the company's own founding date. It was a man's voice, warm and unhurried, telling someone named Addie that he was proud of her, that whatever she decided to do with her life, she should do it because it made her feel like herself again, not because it made anyone else comfortable. The voice cracked slightly near the end, the way voices do when someone is trying not to cry while trying to sound steady. Callum found himself listening to the recording twice before he realized what he was doing, caught by something he could not immediately name. Some quiet ache buried in the sincerity of that voice. He was still standing there when the door opened behind him, and the air in the room seemed to change instantly. Adrienne Voss entered the way she entered every room, with the kind of composed authority that made junior staff instinctively straighten their posture. She was 34 years old, one of the youngest chief executives in the entire predictive security sector, a woman whose name appeared regularly in industry publications alongside words like relentless and unreadable. Her charcoal suit fit with surgical precision, her dark hair pulled into a style that left no room for softness, her expression carved from something that resembled patience but was closer to exhaustion, carefully disguised. She had built a reputation over the better part of a decade for being nearly impossible to read, and very few people in her professional life had ever seen anything resembling vulnerability cross her face. She stopped just inside the doorway when she heard the recording still playing faintly from the speaker, and for a fraction of a second, something flickered behind her eyes. Something between panic and recognition before her expression smoothed back into its usual composed mask. For one long suspended moment, neither of them said a word. The silence stretched across the room like something physical, thick enough that even the assistant lingering near the doorway seemed to stop breathing. Callum understood immediately that he had stumbled into something private, something the woman standing across from him had never intended to share with a stranger who had walked in only to fix a broken server. He reached to silence the recording, to explain that he had not meant to hear anything, that the file had simply played when the vault opened. But before he could speak a single word, Adrienne crossed the room, stopped directly in front of him, and studied his face with an intensity that made the rest of the closet seem to disappear entirely. "Did he sound like he meant it?" she asked. The words landed in the room like something dropped from a great height. The assistant near the door went perfectly still. Adrienne Voss did not ask questions like that. She did not reveal uncertainty of any kind. Not in board meetings, not in interviews, not in the countless negotiations where her reputation for relentless composure had become something of a legend across the industry. Callum did not answer right away. He had learned long ago, both in his own grief and in the years that followed it, that some questions were never really about what they appeared to be about on the surface. A person did not ask a stranger whether a dead man's voice sounded sincere, because they cared about a stranger's ear for tone. They asked because somewhere beneath that simple question sat a much larger, much older ache, something that had been building quietly for years, waiting for a moment when the walls finally slipped just enough to let it through. He thought of the crack in the recorded voice, the specific wait in the pause before the man said her name. "He meant every word of it," Callum said. "You can hear it in the pause before he says your name. People don't fake that kind of hesitation. They only have it when they're trying not to lose control of their own voice. Adrienne went very still. For a moment, her carefully maintained composure wavered, just barely. Just enough for Callum to notice the faint tremor along her jaw before she caught it and smoothed it away. In 9 years of running this company, she had been told all manner of comforting things by investors trying to charm her, by reporters searching for an easy headline, by relatives who had barely known her father and offered platitudes anyway. Not one of them had ever actually listened to the recording closely enough to notice the hesitation at all. She turned away from him for a moment, composing herself, her hand resting briefly against the edge of the server rack, as though she needed something solid to hold on to. When she turned back, her expression had returned to its usual professional calm. But something in her eyes had shifted. Some door left slightly open that had been sealed shut for years. She thanked him for repairing the system in a tone that sounded almost formal, almost rehearsed. And the small crowd of employees who had gathered to witness the strange encounter began drifting back to their desks, whispering among themselves about what they had just seen. Before Callum could gather his tools and leave, Adrienne asked him to stay a little longer. She did not explain why. She simply said the words quietly, almost as though she were surprised to hear herself say them. And Callum found himself agreeing before he had fully considered what he was agreeing to. The request came the following afternoon, delivered not through the usual channels, but through a personal message sent directly from Adrienne's office. She wanted Callum to remain with the company for a temporary period, officially as an infrastructure consultant, though the specifics of the role were left deliberately vague. The offer surprised nearly everyone who heard about it, including Callum himself, who had assumed his work at Meridian had ended the moment the server rebooted successfully. Word spread quickly through the executive floor, and not everyone welcomed the news. Several senior directors expressed open frustration in meetings that Callum was not invited to attend, but heard about anyway through the quiet channels of office gossip. A contractor who fixed broken hardware now had access to sensitive systems, working in close proximity to the chief executive herself, without any of the vetting or credentials the rest of the leadership team had spent years accumulating. Some accused him quietly but pointedly of manipulating the situation to his own advantage, of somehow engineering his way into Adrienne's confidence for reasons that had nothing to do with security work. Callum heard the whispers and let them pass without comment. He had never cared much for office politics, and he cared even less now, given that his only real interest lay in the technical mystery still buried somewhere inside the company's network. The corrupted vault he had unlocked on Adrienne's private server was, he suspected, only a symptom of something larger. Systems did not accidentally decay like that without a reason, and the deeper he looked into the company's infrastructure, the more that instinct began to feel justified. Over the following days, he worked quietly in a small office near the data center, reviewing logs that most employees never bothered to examine, tracing patterns of activity that seemed at first glance entirely unremarkable. It was only when he cross-referenced access times against departmental travel schedules that something began to feel wrong. Certain research files were being duplicated at hours when no legitimate business justified it, funneled through a shell vendor account disguised carefully enough that an ordinary audit would have missed it entirely. Someone inside Meridian Cognition Group was quietly extracting proprietary algorithms, and they had been doing it for long enough to become dangerously confident in their own invisibility. Callum said nothing to anyone yet. He had learned through hard experience that accusations without proof destroyed careers and reputations just as thoroughly as the crimes themselves, and he intended to be certain before he spoke a single word about what he suspected. He continued gathering evidence in silence, unaware that the answers he was searching for would soon collide violently with his growing, cautious friendship with the woman who had hired him. Adrienne began seeking him out more often than the consulting arrangement strictly required. At first, the visits carried a professional pretense. A question about a threat report, a request to review an unusual vendor invoice, something that gave her an excuse to appear near his temporary office without admitting the real reason she kept finding herself there. Gradually, the pretenses grew thinner until she simply appeared some evenings after most of the staff had gone home, carrying 2 cups of coffee, and settling into the chair across from his desk as though it were the most natural thing in the world. It was during one of those quiet evenings, wind rattling steadily against the windows behind her, that she finally told him about the recording. She explained that her father had left it on her phone the night before he died, unexpectedly, of a heart attack. Back when she was 25 and finishing a doctorate in applied mathematics she had never intended to abandon. She had wanted, at the time, to teach. To spend her life quietly proving theorems that mattered to almost no one outside a small circle of researchers who loved the work as much as she did. That version of her life ended the following week, when the board of her father's struggling startup called an emergency meeting and asked, in terms that left no real room for refusal, whether she would step in. Within 18 months, she found herself running a company she barely understood, expected to project unwavering confidence to investors who were only waiting for an excuse to doubt a woman so young and inexperienced. From that point forward, she explained, no one around her ever asked whether the recording still comforted her. They asked about quarterly earnings. They asked about market share and competitive positioning against rival firms. Somewhere during those relentless years of performance and pressure, the woman who had once found peace in a quiet office full of equations had quietly disappeared, replaced by someone polished and unreadable, someone the industry respected and occasionally feared, but very rarely understood. Callum listened without interrupting, recognizing in her words an echo of something he had lived through himself. He did not tell her the details of his own collapse, the accident he still replayed some nights, the friendship that had not survived his grief, the quiet, grinding years afterward spent rebuilding a life stripped down to its simplest form. He understood, in a way words could not easily capture, exactly what it felt like to lose yourself so gradually that you barely noticed the disappearance until it was already complete. He offered her no advice, no reassurance dressed up as wisdom. He simply sat with her in the silence. And for reasons neither of them fully examined, that silence felt like enough. The crisis arrived without warning on a Tuesday morning, when the entire company discovered that a major client's proprietary model had been leaked to a competitor days before a scheduled launch. The scale of the leak was staggering, threatening not only the company's competitive position but also a pending federal contract that demanded absolute confidentiality as a condition of continued negotiation. Panic spread through the executive floor within hours. Board members demanding immediate answers, lawyers preparing statements, the client threatening to walk away entirely. Within the chaos, suspicion turned almost immediately toward Callum. Badge records appeared to show him entering the data center late at night on dates that matched suspiciously well with the timeline of the leak. Several board members, already uneasy about his presence in the company, seized on the records as proof of exactly what they had feared from the beginning: that an unvetted outsider had been given far too much access far too quickly without proper oversight. They called for his immediate removal and threatened to involve federal investigators. Adrienne found herself standing at the center of an impossible choice. On one side stood her entire board of directors, seasoned executives with decades of combined experience, presenting what appeared to be damning evidence. On the other side stood a man she had known for only a matter of weeks, a contractor with no formal position within the company, whose only real credential in her eyes was the quiet integrity she had witnessed firsthand in the private moments they had shared after hours. Every rational argument favored trusting her board. Every instinct she possessed told her something else entirely. She called an emergency meeting late that evening, gathering the board members, her legal counsel, and Callum himself into the same room. The tension so thick it felt almost physical. The badge logs played on the main screen, timestamps glowing beneath data that appeared at first glance undeniable. Board members spoke over one another, demanding immediate termination of Callum's contract, and a full investigation into how such a serious lapse had been allowed to happen under Adrienne's direct authorization. Adrienne listened to every argument in complete silence, her expression giving away nothing, though anyone watching closely might have noticed the way her hands remained perfectly still on the table in front of her, a stillness that came only from tremendous effort. When the room finally quieted, waiting for her decision, she looked directly at Callum for a long moment before turning back to her board. In a voice that allowed no room for further debate, she stated that she trusted him, and that the investigation would continue under his direction rather than his dismissal. The room erupted into fresh protest, several directors openly questioning her judgment, suggesting that her personal feelings had compromised her professional responsibilities to the company and its shareholders. Adrienne absorbed the accusations without visible reaction, though something in her posture straightened, some quiet resolve settling over her that had not been present moments earlier. She informed the board that she would take full personal responsibility if her trust proved misplaced, and that until proven otherwise, Callum Reyes would be given the resources and authority necessary to identify the true source of the leak. Callum requested only one thing before the meeting adjourned. He asked for 24 hours of uninterrupted, complete access to the badge system and network logs, and no interference from anyone on the executive floor. Adrienne granted the request without hesitation, silencing further objections from her board with a single look that made it clear the discussion had ended. As the room emptied, and the tension slowly dissipated into the hallway beyond, Callum remained behind, already pulling up the first lines of code that would either vindicate her trust or destroy everything both of them had quietly begun to build. He worked through the entire night without stopping, fueled by coffee gone cold, and the quiet hum of servers that never slept. The badge records presented as evidence against him had been cloned. He was certain of that within the first hour, though proving it required tracing the duplication back through layers of access control metadata that most people would never think to examine. Card scans could be spoofed easily enough by anyone with the right equipment. But the underlying system left traces that were far more difficult to disguise. Small inconsistencies in signal timing and card reader firmware logs that revealed exactly when and how the badge data had been forged. By early morning, Callum had reconstructed enough of the deleted network logs to trace the actual pattern of unauthorized access across the previous 14 months, far longer than anyone at the company had initially suspected. The pattern was careful, deliberate, executed by someone who understood the company's security architecture intimately enough to move through it almost invisibly. Whoever was responsible had not stumbled into this scheme by accident. They had built it methodically over a very long period of time, exfiltrating proprietary models in small, carefully spaced increments designed to avoid triggering any automated alerts. The trail eventually led him to a set of credentials that had been used repeatedly to access the most sensitive research files in the company's possession, credentials belonging not to some outside hacker, but to someone deeply embedded within the organization itself. Callum cross-referenced the access patterns against employee schedules, expense reports, and internal communications, narrowing the field of possible suspects, until only one name remained consistent across every single instance of unauthorized access. The chief technology officer, a man named Preston Vance, who had served on the executive team for nearly a decade, had been quietly selling the company's proprietary models to a rival firm for years. He had built an elaborate system of consulting invoices and disguised transactions to hide the money trail, confident that his seniority and long tenure with the company placed him beyond suspicion. When confronted with the evidence Callum had assembled, meticulously documented and impossible to dispute, Vance's carefully constructed composure finally cracked, and the full extent of his betrayal came pouring out in a confession that left the entire board speechless. The revelation sent shock waves through the company that lasted for weeks afterward. Vance was terminated immediately and turned over to federal authorities for prosecution. His decade of service revealed as nothing more than an elaborate, patient betrayal that had cost the company untold millions in stolen research and lost competitive advantage. The board members, who had so confidently accused Callum just days earlier, found themselves in the uncomfortable position of offering awkward, half-hearted apologies, though none of them ever fully acknowledged how close they had come to destroying an innocent man's reputation based on evidence that had been deliberately manufactured against him. Adrienne said very little publicly about the entire ordeal, choosing instead to handle the aftermath with the same measured composure she brought to every crisis the company had weathered under her leadership. Privately, however, something inside her had shifted permanently. She had chosen to trust a man she barely knew over an entire board of experienced executives, and that choice had been proven right in the most public and consequential way imaginable. The experience left her with a clarity she had not expected, a growing awareness that her instincts, so often suppressed beneath years of corporate caution, deserved more room to breathe than she had ever allowed them. Several evenings after the scandal finally settled and the company's operations returned to something resembling normalcy, Adrienne found Callum alone in his temporary office, packing away the last of the equipment he had used during the investigation. She stood in the doorway for a long moment before speaking, watching him work with the same quiet focus she had noticed the very first day they met, when he had solved in 25 minutes a problem that had defeated 2 entire security firms. She asked him a question that had been sitting unspoken between them since the very beginning, ever since that strange, unplanned moment when a broken server had briefly revealed a recording never meant for anyone else to hear. Why, she asked, had he not simply told her the recording was touching, the way anyone else in his position surely would have? It would have been easy, expected, the kind of harmless comfort that cost nothing and pleased almost everyone who heard it. Callum set down the cable he had been coiling and considered the question seriously before answering, the way he considered every question that actually mattered to him. He told her that in that moment, she had not really been asking about the recording's tone at all. She had been asking whether the version of her father who had loved her without conditions was still real, still trustworthy, still something she could hold on to in a life that had since demanded she trust almost no one completely. Calling it touching would have answered a question she had not actually asked, and would have missed entirely the deeper ache sitting underneath it. Adrienne stood perfectly still, absorbing his words in complete silence. For the first time in longer than she could remember, someone had looked past the carefully constructed image she presented to the world and had seen, with startling clarity, exactly what she had been silently searching for without ever fully admitting it to herself. Tears gathered unexpectedly in her eyes, and she made no attempt to hide them. A small but significant departure for a woman who had spent years training herself never to show weakness in front of anyone, especially not in her own office, especially not in front of an employee. She admitted quietly that no one had ever asked her that question before. The real question buried beneath her original words. The one about whether her father's faith in her still meant anything in a life that had turned out so differently from the one he had encouraged her to choose. Callum did not offer easy comfort or hollow reassurance. He simply told her the truth as he understood it. That people did not lose the people who loved them entirely, no matter how deeply they buried the grief beneath obligation and expectation, and that whatever her father had believed about her that night was still true now, waiting for permission to matter again. In the weeks that followed, something in Adrienne began slowly and almost imperceptibly to shift. She started arriving at meetings without the same rigid armor she had worn for years, allowing small moments of genuine warmth to surface in interactions where she once would have maintained strict professional distance. She laughed more easily during casual conversations with her staff, surprising employees who had worked alongside her for years and had never once seen her express anything resembling spontaneous joy. She began declining certain media appearances that existed solely to reinforce her public image, choosing instead to invest that time in a small research fellowship she quietly funded for graduate students studying the kind of mathematics she had once loved. The change did not happen all at once, and it was not without moments of doubt, old habits reasserting themselves whenever pressure mounted or old insecurities resurfaced. But gradually, the distance between the woman who had once wanted only to teach and the woman running the company began to narrow. The gap that had once seemed permanent slowly closing with each small choice she made to prioritize her own well-being alongside her professional responsibilities. Employees throughout the company noticed the shift as well, and the atmosphere on the executive floor grew noticeably lighter. The constant undercurrent of anxiety that had defined the workplace for years slowly easing into something more sustainable. Through all of this quiet transformation, Callum remained careful never to take credit for the change he had helped set in motion. He continued his work at the company on a formal basis, his consulting role converted into a permanent position overseeing infrastructure security. But he never used his proximity to Adrienne to seek personal advantage or advance the relationship beyond what she initiated herself. He never pursued her in any conventional sense, never flattered her, never positioned himself as someone deserving of special attention because of what had passed between them. That restraint, more than anything else he might have said or done, was precisely what drew Adrienne toward him more deeply than she had expected. She had spent years surrounded by people who wanted something from her. Investors seeking returns, executives seeking influence, suitors seeking the prestige of being associated with a powerful, successful woman. Callum wanted none of that. He showed up, did his work with quiet competence, and treated her not as a chief executive to be managed or a prize to be won, but simply as a person deserving of honesty and respect in a world that had spent years reducing her to a title and a valuation. That simple, uncomplicated regard felt like the rarest gift she had ever received. 1 year passed, marked by steady growth for the company and a quieter, more personal kind of growth that unfolded entirely outside the public eye. Meridian Cognition Group secured a landmark federal partnership that had once seemed impossible following the leak, rebuilding its reputation through transparency and stronger internal safeguards that Callum himself had helped design. On the evening, the company celebrated its most significant achievement to date. The entire executive floor filled with the kind of energy that came only from hard-fought, well-earned success. Reporters gathered for the occasion, eager to capture the traditional celebratory photograph of the chief executive standing triumphantly before the assembled crowd. The kind of polished image that would appear in business publications the following morning, reinforcing once again the carefully curated persona the public had grown accustomed to seeing. A photographer approached Adrienne with practiced efficiency, requesting she pose near the company banner for what would undoubtedly become the defining image of the evening's coverage. Adrienne declined, politely but firmly, surprising the photographer and several nearby staff members who had never once seen her turn down an opportunity for favorable press coverage. Instead, she quietly excused herself from the celebration, crossing the room to where Callum stood near the edge of the gathering, deliberately positioned outside the spotlight, as he always preferred to be. She took his hand without explanation and led him toward the private terrace attached to her office, away from the noise and performance of the party still unfolding behind them. Outside, the wind had softened into something almost still, the kind of quiet Chicago rarely offered, settling gently over the river lights spread out below them. Adrienne pulled out her phone, opened a new recording, and asked Callum to simply say something, anything, into it with her. Nothing scripted, nothing arranged, no careful consideration of what it should sound like. He thought for a moment, then told her, plainly, that he was proud of the woman standing beside him, that whatever she decided to do with the rest of her life, she should do it because it made her feel like herself, not because it made anyone else comfortable. He heard his own voice catch slightly near the end, the way voices do when someone is trying not to lose control of it, and he did not try to hide it. Adrienne stopped the recording and stood very still, staring at the small waveform glowing on her screen, comparing it silently to the one still saved from years earlier, the one that had started everything between them on an ordinary morning that neither of them had expected to matter at all. She looked up at him then and asked quietly the same question she had asked him on that very first day, though this time her voice carried none of the fragile uncertainty it once had. Did he mean it? She wanted to know, the way her father once had. Callum looked at the phone in her hand, then at her, standing beside him in the stillness, the city lights catching faintly in her eyes. He told her simply and without embellishment that he meant every word of it, and that unlike anything a camera could capture or any performance could fake, this was the only kind of proof that had ever truly mattered. The kind that came from actually being known. Adrienne smiled then. The same unguarded warmth that had once lived only in a recording meant for no one but her, and stepped closer to him. The quiet settling gently around them both as the noise of celebration continued faintly behind the glass. The broken server that had first brought them together had been repaired long ago. Its malfunction resolved within 25 minutes on an ordinary winter morning that neither of them could have known would change everything. But what Callum had truly repaired, slowly and without ever intending to, was something far more delicate and far more important than any machine. He had helped a woman the world believed was untouchable remember how to be known again, and in doing so, he had found something in himself that he thought he had lost for good as well. Standing together on that quiet terrace above the river, with the noise of celebration continuing faintly behind the glass, there was no longer any distance between a powerful chief executive and an ordinary man who fixed broken systems for a living. There was only the two of them, present and unguarded, exactly as they were, no titles required and no performance necessary. It was, in the end, a beginning far more honest than either of them had ever expected to find, one built not on the polish of appearances, but on the quiet, steady truth of being truly known.